Okay, I'm back again here, and what I'm going to discuss today for this first rather lengthy lecture will be the Middle Ages. Okay, sometimes that's the noun term. Sometimes it's referred to as medieval, which is the adjective for the period. It's a period in history, it's European history, decentralized, that is, you lost the major central governing force of Rome. It's tribal and therefore diverse in the makeup and how things were done. It's characterized by a loss of literacy, and the institution that dominates is the church, both in the West and in the Byzantine Empire. Your text has a similar map on page 296. I hit computer in that document. Okay, and it just shows the various tribal entities that come out of Central Asia, Northern Europe, etc. And you have kind of a population explosion, and you have a economic difference between the wealthy Roman Empire and the poor tribes that sat on the outskirts of the Roman Empire and were sometimes either evicted, kept out, or sometimes employed as mercenaries in the latter Roman Empire. But as we know, by 476, they had penetrated across the Rhine into France, into Spain, into North Africa, into Italy, and Rome itself. The one bastion against all of this is the Byzantine Empire, and that's where I'm going to start out with the lecture that'll go through much of the class. However, I do want to make sure that you're clear on what your essay questions will be and where the identifications will come from. As I said, one will be on the evolution of Christianity from Judaism to the Great Schism. Another will be Greek history from the Minoans all the way through Alexander. Roman history from the Etruscans all the way through the fall of Rome in 476 of the Common Era. What I'm going to focus on today for the next couple classes will be discuss the changes in Europe from the fall of Rome, the rise of Byzantium, which we'll talk about now, and the development of feudalism. Now, you won't know anything about any of those because I haven't talked about them much. So that'll be the focus of the next couple lectures. The other two questions would be about Islam, the 5 pillars, the basic beliefs, etc. And then a separate question on Islam would be the differences between Sunni and Shia Muslims and the impact of that in the modern world. I also threw a 7th question in there, traced the development of Greek philosophy from the Ionians to Aristotle. That's probably the more difficult question, but some of you may have a philosophical bent and want to do that. So that's 7 questions, and you will pick 2 of those. So you should start to be getting organized about that. In terms of your terms, what I'm going to do is I'm going to have about 10 or 12 terms, people, issues from Greek history. You'd pick 3 of those, and then another group from Roman history, and you would pick 3 of those, answering them both in 2 or 3 complete sentences. So, should have a good idea of what I'm going to examine you on. And now we'll move into the stabilizing element within medieval society, or during the Middle Ages. Now, that term Middle Ages is reflective kind of a bias. The term really comes from where we'll get at the end of this series of lectures, and that is the Renaissance. And the Renaissance saw itself as the rebirth of classical Greek and Roman history and culture, art, mathematics, science, and so on, and it was. And so the scholars of the Renaissance period just simply named the period between the fall of Rome and their wonderful period, the Middle Ages, something in between these two other glorious sorts of events or cultures that went on. In fact, they went so far as to call the early years after the fall of Rome the Dark Ages, when things were really, really backward. Now, that's not entirely true, but it is a period, a step backwards from where Greco-Roman culture and Greco-Roman society was. But it was preserved in what was called Byzantium, or the Byzantine Empire. Now, as we've talked about before, it was always part of the Roman Empire from the time they conquered Greece about 146 BCE and took over from Antiochus and his successors there. But it was Constantine who took it upon himself to really take an old city that had been around for quite a while and really dress it up and make it his capital. And after the collapse in 476, it became the continuation of the Roman Empire. As this text said here, is that Constantinople became the capital of the Roman Empire. And they always considered themselves to be a continuation of the Roman Empire. And it survived here what is described as the fragmentation and fall of the Western Roman Empire. Let's see what we have here. It's this interactive map here. Again, this is the growth of Rome. Here it is, expanding through Italy. The Punic Wars will be next, where they take over Carthage. Then you see the conquest of Greece. This is what becomes Byzantium here. This is the heyday, the Pax Romana of all the way up to Marcus Aurelius. Now you start to see a decline, a shrinking, the division between East and West, a real distinction, and then by 480 the Roman Empire has disappeared and there's only Byzantium left as an organized political entity. So it held on for the longest time as the remnant of the Roman Empire. Let me see where. Okay, we're back here. And it held on, as we've talked about before, until it fell to the Ottoman Turks in 1453. That's 1,000 years almost after the fall of Rome. The period after the fall of the West, all the way into the 500s, is a transition period between the Greek East and the Latin West. They began to have a little bit of religious divergence in terms of orthodoxy in the Byzantine Empire and Catholicism in the former Roman part of the empire. And eventually the official language went from Latin to Greek, even though they continued to claim to be the Roman Empire. Borders expanded and contracted. Here it is at its height under the Emperor Justinian. And as you see, they've reacquired a good deal of the old Roman Empire here. The trouble is they used so much resources, time, men, manpower, etc., that it ended up being a net loss for the empire, because eventually they lost the western part anyway, and they'd have been far better off focusing their energies internally than they were. Now, the person that I want to focus on here is Justinian. Justinian is probably the greatest of the Byzantine Empire emperors. And this is a portrait of Justinian, but it's not a painting, it's a mosaic. It's ceramic tiles, colored ceramic tiles that are broken up and put together to create this rather unique kind of artwork that's very characteristic of the Byzantine period. And this is the best image, one of the better images we have of Justinian. Now, the name is Justinian, And from his name, we get the term justice. What Justinian did was, in his claim to be the heir to the Roman emperor and his real physical attempt to reconstitute the empire, is he wanted to make law for the entire empire uniform. Now we're looking in the 500s, 550s, and the laws in Rome, they have evolved from 500 BCE all the way to Justinian's time. That's 1,000 years, and there was a hodgepodge of laws, sometimes in conflict with one another, some very, very inconsistent and unfair. And what he did was he put together a group of legal scholars, and they wrote for 20 years until they came up with the Justinian Code, which was a uniformity in the legal practices throughout the Byzantine Empire. It was so well regarded that it in fact became the law codes for many of the barbarian empires that evolved, or kingdoms that evolved after his term. So that's his major accomplishment there in terms of that. He reorganized the empire. Constantinople, during his reign, probably had a population of 350,000. Maybe not the largest city in the world, but certainly one of the largest. And they claimed to control about 2/3 of the world's wealth. That wasn't true, probably. They had no idea of the wealth of China and India, let alone sub-Saharan Africa or the Americas. But it was probably the wealthiest city in the world at that particular time, and you evolved into an educated bureaucratic class that helped with the administration of this gigantic movement of wealth through the city, and they became a separate ruling class themselves. I won't say a ruling class, but a separate class with its own interest and a real power base within the empire. Now, make no mistake about it, the Byzantine emperors were absolute monarchs. They expected their orders to be followed. There was a Senate that rubber-stamped the actions of the emperor, and of course, the Orthodox Church in general supported the position of the emperor. I don't know of very many times where there was any open conflict between the Orthodox Church and the Byzantine emperors during that time. So they were pretty close to absolute monarchs. Sometimes Justinian is referred to as the last Roman. I don't want to leave Justinian. I'm going to talk about him a little bit more, but a very important person in his life was his wife. Let's see, it's the Nika riots. Theodora was his wife's name. Trying to look for her here. I'm going to get some terms. Here she is, Theodora. Oops, that wasn't on the computer. And here is a mosaic of Theodora. I'll double back. I saw I didn't have the computer on, so I'll show you the mosaic of Justinian as well. But here she is. She's unusual. She was, for all intents and purposes, the co-ruler and had a great deal of influence on Justinian. And she saved him here. He was about to abdicate as there was a riot, believe it or not, over a series of chariot races in Constantinople. At least that was the flashpoint of it. And she kind of stiffened his backbone up, and he put the riots down and became that absolute monarch that I just described. She's unusual in that before she married Justinian, she worked in a circus. Her father trained bears, and she was his assistant. Procopius, who is the main biographer of of Justinian, didn't like her particularly and suggested that she may in fact have been a prostitute rather than a worker in a circus. But there's no other reference to that. But it's, again, the example of why you got to check the biases of your sources. when you're dealing with anything. So there's and here is that. This is the mosaic of Justinian. So they're both, and more and more of these are being found. Over these centuries, they got covered up with several feet of dirt, etc. And as excavations go on, more and more of these mosaics are being uncovered, not just of those two, but just decorative types in general. Because of its nature, as a trade center, it was cosmopolitan. And by cosmopolitan, we're not talking about the magazine or the drink. We're talking about the fact that the population of the city was very diverse. People from all over the world, from Persia, from India, from Africa. The guards for the emperor came from England and Scandinavia, on the far outskirts of European civilization, and so it was very, very diverse. But because it was so wealthy, it was also subject to constant siege. The sieges came from all directions, from the north, from the Slavic tribes, from the Goths, the Huns, etc. But because of the strength of the walls, first by Constantine, and then by later emperors, they were able to withstand all sieges for over 1,000 years as it took place. What you basically had was a period, again, of peace and prosperity, in which arts flourished and the economy just boomed, probably to the excess of everything outside of maybe imperial China during that particular time period. There was a little bit of shakeup in the 9th and 10th centuries, and the Justinian dynasty was replaced by the Macedonian dynasty. But this was accomplished with very little real transitional difficulties during that particular time period. But, and we'll double back here, by about 1000 or so, the Dark Ages were over in Western Europe, and there started to be a reemergence of strength and power, and it came to an open clash that took place. And as we've talked about it before, in 1054, the Great Schism occurs. And this kind of, not the cause of, but it's the point at which you start to see a significant decline in Byzantium. And that decline continues on, for another 400 years. This is a major turning point here. The Battle of Manzikert occurs. And this fight is not with the Arab Muslims, with whom the Byzantines had been fighting regularly, nor the Persians, with whom they had been fighting quite a bit. It was with the Seljuk Turks. And the Seljuks were a very, very fearsome rival, and they did such huge damage to the Byzantine army that it was never quite the same. They retreated back into Turkey proper, which is still not called Turkey at this point, and really decreased the size of the empire and gave up huge chunks of territory to these Turks. And really, there was a real worry and concern on all parts that the Byzantine Empire might be falling to the same fate as Rome. So in 1092, the Byzantine emperor does the unthinkable. He appeals to the Pope for assistance in helping him to fight the Seljuks. and the excuse comes to be that the Seljuks weren't allowing Christians to go to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Bethlehem and Jerusalem, and so on. That wasn't entirely correct. Probably could have been negotiated, but he made this point. And what this launches is doesn't happen exactly in 1092, but that's when his request went to Rome as 1092, and it's the beginning of that period that is known as the Crusades. And I'll get to that by the end of this particular lecture. But it changes things in a very dramatic fashion. And while the Crusades were supposed to help the Byzantines out, it ended up being their demise, particularly when they were vandalized by the Fourth Crusade. And as I said, we'll get along to that later. So that is Byzantium. The other thing that the Byzantines did is they organized church councils. Anytime there was a question about church teaching or church belief, they would actually, in cooperation with the Latin Church, sit down, organize church councils, and then say, this is what the belief system is. And it's really why both Orthodoxy and Roman Catholicism have remained pretty consistent over a couple thousand years, is the imperiums from these various church councils in which the Byzantines were the lead and the active membership there. This is also in the medieval period where Islam and Western society have an impact on one another. The Islamic states, the Arabic states, the Abbasids in particular, tried to copy the organization of Constantinople and tried to make their capital, Baghdad, to be a model and similar to Constantinople. And in fact, to a large extent, they did that. The contribution of Islam during the Middle Ages was in their entity, in their areas, they saved the Greek and Latin, Roman writings of the classical period, and which had been destroyed and or lost in the western part of Europe. And it wasn't until the Crusades that these were rediscovered or reacquired and brought back to Europe, creating really the basis for the Renaissance. So, what we want to go through next is, and as we talked about, the Byzantine Empire lasts till 1453 when it is finally destroyed by the Ottoman Empire. But the Ottomans, unlike the barbarians in the West, just built on top of what had already existed and were able to create a successful empire of their own. In the West, that was not to be the case. And the institution that really preserved Western culture during the this early period of the Middle Ages, the Dark Ages, and we spent a lot more time on this medieval period than we do now in this course because of the addition of more in-depth study of Eastern and non-Western culture. So we go through this kind of quickly. But the church was a well-organized hierarchy, and a hierarchy is a society based on rank or order. And at the top of that hierarchy was the Pope. And then right below him were the 72 cardinals. Okay, these are basically the pool from which the next pope is probably going to be picked. They pick the pope, and then when he dies, one of their member usually is elected to be the successor pope. So you've got this very stratified society, and then you have the bishops. And the bishops are located in the major cities. Now, There weren't that many of them because as the medieval period goes on, there's not a lot of cities. But what you got out of the Middle Ages, in cities where there were bishops, cathedrals were built, and the Gothic cathedral is, Notre Dame, Chartres, Westminster Abbey. All of these are characteristic, these giant cathedrals of the medieval period. And as you can see, if you can build something like that, you're not really all that backward of a society. And so you've got this church structure there. One of the unique aspects of medieval culture was the development of monasteries. Monasteries were places where men, and to a lesser extent women, who really were so, I won't say upset, but kind of disillusioned with the society that existed during the early medieval period, that they basically just wanted to drop out of society and devote their lives to the cause of religion and the salvation of their own souls. So basically they would just leave their homes and commit themselves to life in a monastery. And these were large institutions, either exclusively for men, monasteries, or for women, convents, nuns that lived there. And they started out as just places of refuge, places for meditation, worship, etc. But you have to survive. And the monasteries became the place where literacy in the West was saved. Now, this is the time period where books are all done by hand. Okay, they're written out, and we've all seen copies of the Bible, and that was the book that was most often written, though not exclusively so. And that very, very long, thick book was all done by hand in the monasteries. And you ask, well, gosh, how could you do that? Well, you've got several hundred people writing simultaneously, and life in a monastery is like this. You get up in the morning, you pray, you go to breakfast, you go to work. You take a lunch break, you pray, you have lunch, pray again, go to work. You come back, pray, have dinner, go to Mass in the evening, go to bed, get up in the morning, and do it all over again. A long, routinized kind of thing, but you're working, 10, 12 hours a day, and if you're doing it every day for 365 days a year, eventually you get turned out a whole book, or at least a part of it. And so these are the ways that monasteries supported themselves. Now, if you weren't a literate monk, you couldn't read and write, or couldn't learn how to read and write, you went to work in the fields, and you produced crops, etc. And the monasteries were kind of like little exempt zones. It was kind of a reason why people went to monasteries was for the safety it brought as well. They weren't attacked by the different barbarian forces because by this time they had been converted to Christianity. And so therefore the monasteries remained exempt from attack and protection. Although they did build walls around them, and sometimes they would come under the protection of a noble or lord. But over time, they began to make products that they could sell for a profit, besides books. The most well-known would be the Benedictine monasteries, their famous liquor, Benedictine, and brandy, B&B, as it's called, and many other items of that nature. And then sometimes wealthy lords would decide they wanted to become a monk, and they would donate their entire fortunes to the monastery. And the monasteries over time became wealthy and powerful institutions in and of themselves. And then down here at the bottom of the pyramid, the most numerous are the local priests. And there was a real need for priests because the population is spread out all over the place. You don't have very many cities, and so every small municipality needed to have its own priest. And I'll get into that in a minute here. But this is, the church is the dominant institution of the Middle Ages. So dominant that they are able to answer the call of the Byzantine emperor and launch crusades. But that takes a while to build up. And the real protectors of the church are the French monarchs. And we'll start out with the first group. Yeah, I didn't quite get what I wanted here, but this is good. This is the Merovingian dynasty, the family tree, and what the church had been looking for was something to protect it. It had been protected by the Roman Empire. When it fell, it was like, oh my gosh, who's going to take care of us? Who's going to keep us from being wiped out or persecuted, etc.? And it fell to the Merovingian dynasty that you see here. And Clovis was the first of the Merovingian kings. He was a Frank, a barbarian who was converted to Christianity. And Clovis, when spoken in French over time, Clovis comes to be Clovis and eventually Louis. And so Clovis is really Louis the First, and the last of the Louis is Louis the 18th. Louis the 16th was the French king who was beheaded during the French Revolution. But, oops, that's not what I wanted here. Okay, and you can see how fragmented the old Roman Empire had become. It's split up into all these little principalities. One Germanic priest or another is ruling over them. Spanish March down here is the little intrusion of the Christian French into Spain, the first such incursion after the Muslim invasions that occurred, and as we know, that went on another 700 years. But Clovis was the first guy to kind of claim kingship over all of this. He was their major warrior, etc. But he didn't really have that much of any long-term control. The problem is the Germanic system of inheritance that took place there, and the law, and this even comes into play even after the person we'll discuss, Charlemagne, in that the requirement is you define by the tribe, the decentralized tribal customs, was you divided your property equally among your sons. Well, that's fair and square, but if you have this big chunk of territory here, and you have 3 sons and you divide it in thirds, okay, then they have 3 sons, so now each of them now has 1/9 of what the original had, and this practice went on till the Merovingian kings actually became less powerful than some of the nobles who were supposed to be serving under them. So this division, this Germanic tradition, eventually gives way to the concept of primogeniture. But this doesn't occur until well along into the medieval period. Primogeniture just simply means the oldest male inherits everything. So that solves and resolves this particular issue. But what happened was the Merovingians, as they kept subdividing their territory, became less and less of a factor, even though they still had the title king. And this becomes an issue and a problem for them, but it also becomes an issue for the papacy because now they don't have this big protector up here anymore. Fortunately for the church and medieval history, beginning with Charles Martel, Now, we talked about him before, and he's the guy that he was a servant, the chief steward, if you will, mayor of the palace of the Merovingian kings, and he's the guy that convinced the Merovingian king to allow him to take on the Muslims in their invasion here at the Battle of Tours. His son Pepin, and he's called Pepin the Short. I guess he was under 5 feet tall. He became the first of the Carolingian kings. Okay, basically, supposedly what occurred is he had a conference with the Pope, and he said, who should be king? The man with the title or the man with the power? And of course, the Pope, always being a very astute kind of politician, said the man with the power. And basically, you have a palace coup where Pepin the Short becomes the king, and his significance is not necessarily his role, but his son Charlemagne. And Charlemagne is kind of the beginning of the decline, the beginning of the end of the decline in the western part of Europe. I didn't want to look at the family tree, but I guess I'll go back and look at that. And so this is Charles Martel up here. This is Pippin, and this is his wife Bertrada, and here's all of his children. But Charlemagne is his main descendant, and as you'll see, Charlemagne had any number of wives, mistresses, etc. He lived a long time, and he outlived many of his wives. But he had a numerous number of children, and upon his death, that caused a considerable problem. This would be an image here of the Carolingian dynasty under Charlemagne at its height. So you can see it's a pretty substantial kingdom. It's kind of almost a rival here to the Byzantine Empire, and it certainly here is a blessing for the papacy. And I'll get to that in a moment. The greatest Carolingian monarch was Charlemagne, which means Charles the Great. And he was crowned the Holy Roman Empire by Pope Leo III on Christmas Eve in 800 of the Common Era. And we'll talk about it. And he created this very controversial political entity called the Holy Roman Empire. As historians will say, it wasn't holy, it wasn't Roman, and it wasn't much of an empire most of its time. So I'll go back to this, the Carolingian Empire. Now, Charlemagne created this empire by going to war every single spring of his 50-year reign. He just simply went out and said, okay, we're going to fight these guys this year, we're going to fight these guys next year, and so on. He began the expansion of Christianity back into the Umayyad Spain, the Umayyad Caliphate here in Spain. But right here is where he really makes a major contribution and why he becomes Holy Roman Emperor. The Lombards were in control. They were a barbarian group, and they were questioning and challenging the authority of the Pope here. And what Charlemagne then did, upon request from the Pope, was march in with his army and one by one defeated the towns and principalities of the Lombards. And then he demanded of them something that is symbolic today, but was very important in the medieval period. He demanded the keys to the city. And the keys to the city were the keys to the drawbridges that would be pulled up when they were attacked. So you could lock or open those gates for protection or for going to the outside, etc. He then took those keys and gave them to the Pope. And this was symbolic, saying to the Lombards, this is the guy who really controls all of this. And this comes to be known as the Papal States. So Charlemagne, and while he was a barbarian and a warrior, he was a devout Christian, sometimes referred to as a holy barbarian. And what he gave was the gift of Charlemagne, and that gift was to the Pope. And for another 1,000 years, the Papal States, that is, land owned by the Pope in the middle of Italy, were a source of power for the papacy, but were a source of disunity for Italy. Italy never was united from the fall of Rome all the way until the 1870s. Long period of time there. So, in thanking the Pope, thanking Charlemagne on Christmas Eve of 800, the year 800, he crowns him at midnight mass in Rome. Charlemagne, as I said, is a devout Christian, and he places the crown on his head, Holy Roman Emperor. Now, this is important for a long time, because the Pope, as God's representative on earth in the Catholic family, he's crowning Charlemagne the king. So, what can you infer from that? Okay, you can't answer because there's nobody here except B. You're inferring that God wants Charlemagne to be the king. And this is the beginning of the concept of the divine right of kings. This is the religious and legal basis that kings claimed their power and their rights came from. It came from God through the church to them. And you can claim divine right. And this is where Charlemagne becomes extremely important for the next 1,000 years or so. Even to this day, you have royal families in Europe. None of them have any real power. The Queen of England has got a good deal of influence on things. But all of them are direct lineal descendants of Charlemagne. And the reason for that being is that if God wanted Charlemagne to be the king, then that power must then go from him to his descendants, through the sons in his line. And so, since 800, the royal families of Europe have been marrying their cousins, with the idea of having some claim via this divine right to some sort of ruling power or other. So it becomes very important throughout the Middle Ages and really even into the early modern period. So what the papacy is trying to create here is an entity, a political entity that's going to protect them in the same way that the Roman Empire in its last couple centuries had done, and the way the Byzantine emperor over here was protecting the Orthodox Church. So even though you have a hierarchy there within the church, there starts to evolve and develop a second hierarchy, and I'll go to this right now and then explain how that evolves. Okay, you had that church hierarchy. You now have a political hierarchy, and after Charlemagne is crowned, the king, he's at the top of the pyramid. And then right below him are the nobles. And we'll talk about their roles. Okay? You've got the church, but that's actually a separate pyramid, as we've talked about before. You have a very, very small middle class. Okay, the middle class, it is smaller than the nobility, and they are located in the towns, which are not a big part of medieval society. And then the bulk of the population falls into the category of serfs. And we'll talk about what each of these mean, and why the whole process of feudalism really evolves as it does. Charlemagne had that great empire, but by 888 it had fallen apart. I'm not seeing this, so I'm going to go to this. Charlemagne, upon his death, and he didn't die of old age. He was a large man. His father was Pippin the Short. He was about, for that time period, he was a giant. Yeah, I guess he was about 6'4", 275 pounds, just an absolutely overwhelming physical specimen, particularly for the times. And one of his soldiers, it was the fall, they were out in a boat. The boat capsized. Some of the soldiers made it to shore, but one couldn't swim. So Charlemagne swam out and, in fact, rescued him, brought him back. But it was a cold day. The water was cold. He caught pneumonia and died shortly thereafter. And so it was kind of a messy sort of succession issue. And he is succeeded by his son, Louis the Pious. Okay, and Louis the Pious means he was very deeply religious. He was not like his father, who was the great warrior. He was, for all of his wives and all of his children, Louis was the only one that survived. All of his children that Charlemagne did not outlive, and so he became the emperor, the Holy Roman Emperor of that particular time. But he never really picked a successor, and so upon his death, there's a big conflict as to what's going to happen. And what happens is Charlemagne's empire here is settled at the Treaty of Verdun, in that it's split into three parts. Okay, one of his sons gets the west, one of his sons gets this middle part here, Italy, and a sliver running all the way up to the North Sea, and then another of his sons here. After this point, this is when the practice of primogeniture comes in. The other thing that Charlemagne did was, as his empire became more complicated, as he needed more help in ruling it, he brought in a monk from England, Alcuin. And what you had during the heyday of Charlemagne's empire, what was known as the Carolinian Renaissance, where he encourages the development of schools. He patronizes, in terms of money, the monasteries to allow them to grow larger. And he brings Alcuin in from England to tutor his children and to tutor the nobility and middle class in the arts of learning. What starts to emerge during this period is the first rudimentary universities. One here in Italy, in Barcelona, the University of what is now the University of Paris, the Sorbonne, begins here. Cordoba in Spain, which is a Muslim university, though the Muslim Spain was quite tolerant and diverse. Jews, Christians, and Muslims all coexisted relatively peacefully together, and all were at Cordoba. In England, You got the development of Oxford. And so while there's not a lot of learning going on, or a lot of colleges, you're starting to get an understanding that this is an important entity. And Charlemagne did a lot to encourage this sort of thing, and it continued somewhat under his sons as well. Now, we'll just talk a little bit about medieval universities. Like, here's our text here. Now, if this were a medieval class, if I was a monk teaching you in your monastery here or in your college, I would just read the book word for word. And you, on your parchment paper, would then copy down what I had written to you. You'd kind of be like a stenographer or a secretary. You would copy it down. Then you would take that home, read it, study it, and then come back the next day and discuss it. Because books were rare and they were expensive. The thing about it is, if these books are copied word for word from what the professor was reading, you've created a whole class full of new books. So you kind of got a backwards publication of things. And this is the way all books were done until about 1454, I think, when the first printing press found its way from China to Germany. And the first book, of course, printed was the Bible on the Gutenberg press. So there was an attempt at a rebirth of learning here during the Carolingian period, but it did not last. Even with the use of primogeniture, medieval Europe was a place of constant change, stress, and indefinite boundaries. Again, if you look here, particularly here in Central Europe, you're going to see that there's no hard lines or boundaries, and that's because they are constantly changing. The medieval period was a period of constant petty warfare that went on, and it really all the way through the late medieval period there. What I want to go to now is the characteristic institution of the Middle Ages. And that is the institution of feudalism. Now, feudalism is not really an intellectual concept. It's not like democracy. It's not like socialism. It's not like fascism. It's not an ideology. What feudalism was an answer to the decentralization and disorganization of the Middle Ages in Europe. And here's the term. You can Google it for your notes. Feudalism was a combination of legal and military customs in medieval Europe. That means the Middle Ages in Europe. Between the 9th and the 15th centuries, between 1800 and 1400. It was a way of structuring society around relationships derived from the holding of land. Okay, the basis of wealth in the Middle Ages was how much land you owned, or how much land you controlled. Because money, just like literacy, had gone into decline. All the gold and silver, not all of it, but significant amounts of it had gone to the Middle East or the Byzantine Empire. Now, there was some in the European empires, but nowhere near enough to be able to support a market economy. And so, what was in the absence of coin, you went back to a barter economy, okay, where you paid for things in goods, and the primary goods that you paid for were agricultural products. It is an exchange of land for service or labor. Okay, that's the basis of it. An exchange of control of land for service or for labor. It describes not a formal political system, but a kind of by consensus arrangement between lords and vassals concerning fiefs, etc. The classic feudalism is a set of reciprocal legal and military obligations among the warrior nobility. Okay, and it's right here. It's between this group here and the ruling king. That's the basis of it. And the way it operated is, if you were below the king, you were his vassals. If you were below the nobles, you were their vassals. The serfs were everybody's vassals. So when you hear the term vassal, it's the relationship from a superior in the hierarchy to the lower in the hierarchy. And the liege was the dominant power. So the king was the liege lord for the nobility. For the serfs, the noble was their liege that they went on. And the amount of land that they controlled was called a fief. Okay, now the peasants didn't control very much. The serfs were not people that had a lot going for them. They were kind of the bottom of the barrel in this particular hierarchy. I want to make sure I don't forget anything before I go into that. Okay, well. And that doesn't clarify it that much, so we'll just go back here. Okay, I'm on the document camera. I'm just going to draw this up in a simplistic fashion because it wasn't exactly like this. It was so complicated and lend itself to all kinds of intrigue, backbiting, and basically medieval society was one of constant petty warfare between various groups. It was meant to maintain the peace, and on a grand scale, it did. But it also had its drawbacks. We'll just say we'll draw this all up. This is France, okay? And Charlemagne's the king. Well, I think he had more than 4, but he would pick his main nobles, the guys that he trusted the most. And their title was Duke. Okay, the Duke of Avignon, the Duke of Burgundy, the Duke of Anjou. They controlled these big, large territories. Why did he do it? Because the empire was too big for him to control and rule by himself. You look at this large empire here that he has, and he's up here in his capital in Aachen. If there's a problem down here in southern France, it takes him a while to get here. And then if there's a problem over here in Saxony, it's going to take him a while to get over there. So as a practical matter, very difficult for him to get around and run the empire by himself. And so he needed help. And so he divided it up into his major trustworthy guys. And basically, Duke of Anjou, you get control of all this land. Here's what you have to do for me. What's the thing that makes government work or run or operate? Now I'm back to that. Here's what I just drew up on the board. The Duke had the responsibility of collecting taxes, administering justice, and armed service. So, as I said, Charlemagne went out every year for 50 years and fought a battle with somebody in the name of Christianity. His nobles, the Duke that controlled a large chunk of territory within his empire, his job was to collect the taxes. His job was to make sure Charlemagne got his share and make sure the church got its share. Administer justice, basically falling to the Justinian Code, which became not universal but widely accepted throughout Europe. and then they were obligated to a period of military service to Charlemagne when he went out to fight. Now, this all depended on winning the battles, and in the case of Charlemagne, that did occur. The reason for the Byzantine Justinian popularity is the Germanic traditions were, to say the least, barbaric. If there was a dispute over a piece of stolen property, a ring, for instance, they would just get out a pot of boiling water, throw the ring in the bottom, and say, okay, God will protect you if you're the real owner. Stick your hand in there and get it out. You know, those kinds of things. Duels, you know, fights to settle a dispute that were refereed and monitored by forces. If you're accused of being a witch, and this is the bad one. If you got accused of being a witch, they would tie your hands and feet and throw you in the river. If you drowned, oh well, you weren't a witch and you're going to heaven. If you got out, if you survived, they burned you as a witch. So you can see where the Justinian Code would have a lot more popularity within it. Now, with the assistance of Charlemagne, the Duke, this was still too large for the Duke to operate. And so what the Duke would do would take his territory and divide it up into even smaller units, and these were run by the Count. So the Duke was the vassal of the king. The king was his liege. But the Counts, they were the vassal of the Duke. And de facto, they were also vassals of the king. But this was their liege lord. And they owed the same thing to him that he owed to the king. And, you know, the impact of all this stuff, what do we call some of our smaller subdivisions here in modern day America? Counties, which the French would spell it E-E-S rather than with the Y. And that comes to us once William the Conqueror, who came out of France, he divided England up into counties with a Y instead of the double E. And then even the Count would have to take his territory and divide it up because it was still too large for him to do by himself. And now you come down to the bottom of this, the nobility. So the nobility was a pyramid within a pyramid. The king at the top, then the duke, then the count, then the knight. And there are other in-between stages, but this is the basic unit. But the knight is the key to it because he's the fighting force. Say the duke has 25 counties, 25 counts working under him, and under Charlemagne, I think there were a couple hundred counties. So he's got that, and each count maybe has 100 knights. So when he says, okay, Charlemagne, all you counts of Anjou, Charlemagne wants to go to war, all you knights, all you counts, bring your knights, and he's got a 2,500-man army, which for the Middle Ages is pretty substantial. And Charlemagne had his own private entourage as well. So it's a society, it's a culture built on warfare and depending on control of land. And this is how bizarre it could be. So you have this count over here, and he's neighbors over here with this count in the adjoining dukedom. And the ruler, the count, dies. Maybe he's killed in battle or something. And now you have a widow, okay, with young children who can't run the count, can't run the county. So what she might do in order to survive is she might marry that count, okay? And now the count has a much larger territory. And this often happened. There wasn't a lot of time for mourning and remorse upon the death of a spouse. Finding the next one relatively quickly, particularly if you're a female in charge, was very important. But now you've got a little bit of a problem, because as the count in this dukedom, you owe your vassalage to this duke, but you've now assumed a degree of vassalage to a different duke, which could be all right since you theoretically all work for the king. But what if these two dukes get into a fight? Now you've got to make a choice. And this is where it becomes very, very complex and difficult. And it's amazing that it worked at all, but it did help for the whole medieval period to survive. And this is a great picture here of the aspect of feudalism that was non-military, not fighting, and that was manoralism. And the manor was basically the place where either the knight or the count or the duke might live. Okay, they lived on a manor. And manors, the attempt was to be self-sustaining. To, as you can see from this picture, you had agriculture here, you got an orchard over here, you've got this guy over here plowing the field, you've got sheep over here, etc. And then this is why people agreed to be serfs, is that if there was trouble, they could go right here. Whoops, I'm not on the computer. This is the manor. And this on the manor is the castle. And the castle is not there to be the palace of the princess or the queen or whatever, though they were quite palatial in many cases if you were one of the upper nobility. It is a fort. The castle is a fort, whereby these guys over here, if somebody shows up with an invading army or force, they can beat feet and head inside the protection of the castle walls. And that's why they agreed for their own protection to live like this. Even monasteries had serfs that worked for them in this particular manner. Let's see if I can... Okay, here on the computer here, this is another example. These little crosshatches, these are all little pieces of territory that each individual serf was responsible for maintaining. Here you have the common area where the animals grazed in common. That's where the term commons comes from, etc. Boston Commons, etc. You had that. And the serf plowed the land here, but he didn't get to keep everything. He had to pay a portion of what he raised to his liege lord, which is either the local knight or the local count, etc. And there are just dozens of these chopped up here in between. Out here you have the woods, and those belong to the lord. You were not allowed into the woods, because what you got out of the woods was meat, deer, other animals, etc. And the serfs were not allowed to hunt in the king's woods or the lord's woods, whatever the relationship might be. And so this medieval society was largely a vegetarian society. You did have animals, maybe chicken and geese, that were raised on this manor. But largely it was a very, very bland, dull diet. A lot of oatmeal. And sometimes it would be diluted very thinly to what was called gruel, which, not nasty tasting, but not very tasty at all. And thus, in Europe, this got the castle up here was for protection, but the basic food being this bran gruel. And the only thing that really gave some diversity and divergence to the peasant diet was sugar and spice. Two things in very rare supply, because each of these manors was to be largely self-sufficient, which they never could be because they didn't have enough resources. Just as warfare being the basis, you needed steel swords. Well, there's not very many iron mines here on most manors. So you had to, the encouragement here was to get the peasant to produce as much as possible, take that grain in taxation, and then trade it for products that you couldn't build there. Here in the center, you have the manor house. There's also a church, and this is kind of an interesting dynamic because, as you recall, there's two parallel hierarchies here: the political hierarchy, the secular hierarchy, and the church. And this guy right here, the guy who's the parish priest or the manor priest, he's torn betwixt and between because he's dependent on the lord of the manor for his economic survival most of the time, because the serfs didn't have much in the way of monetary contributions to give him. So he therefore had to be on good footing with the lord of the manor, but he was also the chief spy for the papacy, for the church hierarchy. And this was the way in which the church kept an eye on the political situation. And also it's the manner in which the dukes and the kings kept an eye on their lower vassals to make sure they weren't plotting and scheming to take over. See, I forgot to get the computer on again. Here's the manor right here in the middle, and then here's the church. It's even more difficult for the peasant because even if he, with his own grain, he had to take it to the mill, to the river that ran right through, or the stream that ran through, and he'd have to pay a fee for that to have his crop ground up so he could turn it into bread for survival, or into meal where he could turn it into oatmeal or some other variation of that line. The diet was not very diverse. They did figure out the idea of crop rotation, but the early medieval system, they went to the two-field system. Where one year you planted in that field, and then the other year it was fallow. You didn't plant there at all, and then the next year you'd plant there, the other field would be fallow, etc. So at any given time, only half of your land was under cultivation. By the late medieval period, they went to the three-field system, where you'd plant, for instance, barley in one field, wheat in another, and then this one would be fallow. And then you would just rotate it every year. And you therefore got a larger production. This was also the result of technological advances, and that they finally figured out how to use horses instead of oxen. They figured out a harness where you put the harness around the belt, around the middle of the horse, rather than around his neck and choke him. So you gradually got some improvement in crop production, etc. But this was, as you can see, a largely rural and agricultural kind of an entity, and it became more and more the norm as the petty warfare of the medieval period took its toll, and feudalism became the nature, the basic nature of things. But it was politically fragmented, and the real cultural unification came from the church, and the church really advanced its strength and power because its official language remained Latin, and that's what the Bible was written in. And thus, French spoke French, the Spanish spoke Spanish, the German spoke German, but the only people that spoke Latin, the Word of God, was the church, and therefore they always maintained that degree of control. And during the early medieval period, there's no question that it was a positive effect, and it is what really saved the society during that time period. Okay, we'll now then go on into what is, I'm going to just Google the Middle Ages here. And, there you have the crucifix, the very indicative that the church dominated, particularly from the period of Charlemagne onward. And generally it's divided into periods: the early Middle Ages, the high Middle Ages, and the late Middle Ages that go on. One of the problems the church did have was educating its priests. Sometimes the local noble would try to elevate one of his brighter serfs to the position of priest. Well, if that person was illiterate, there tended to be some struggle and difficulty, and the church tried to assert itself into these areas and began demanding literacy of every priest, which then enhanced their power, and it came out of the rise of the reform movements, the Cluny reform movements, the various monasteries, really elevated the stature educationally of the local priests. But as the major nobles became more and more powerful, they came to resent the power of the church in it. And the big issue, the big battle, came over the bishops. The bishops were the people that oversaw the priests, to whom the priests owed their religious authority, and it was very difficult even for the local lord who appointed the priest to challenge the bishop on that. But as the medieval period went on, the bishops also became dependent on this system because they had to survive. And they got their land and their manor, their church, etc., from the church. But as some of the nobles became more and more powerful, they would start to squeeze the bishops a little bit. Maybe take some of their land, or get them in a position where they didn't allow them to keep all the donations that they got, or they maybe cut off their donations for a given time period, because what they wanted was the political control over the bishop. And this all comes to a height over the battle of investiture. And that is, who is going to give the bishop his land? Who's going to give him the amount of land, determine his salary, give him the scepter and the staff by which is his authority? And the Holy Roman Emperor, Henry IV, decides that he's going to defy the Pope. Now, what you'll notice is, the further a ruler is away from Rome, the more likely he is to defy the Pope. So Henry IV says, baloney, I'm appointing the bishops and I'm deciding how much land they get. He gets into an argument with the Pope, Gregory VII, and the Pope uses his ultimate power. And what is the ultimate power? He excommunicates Henry IV. Now, this is bad enough for Henry, because now he's going to go to hell. But the longer he's excommunicated, and he remains so, the people underneath him, the dukes, the counts, even the serfs, townspeople, go, wait a minute, we don't want a guy that is under Satan's power ruling over us, and he could be in danger of being overthrown and replaced on religious grounds. So Henry finally gives in. He finds out where the Pope is vacationing. He's vacationing up in the Alps, and it happens to be snowing. And Henry goes and he takes off his royal robes, puts on a burlap sack as his clothes, and he's up in the mountains, so it's snowing, and he's standing there barefoot in the snow outside the Pope's window, crying, begging for forgiveness, etc. And after 3 days, the Pope forgives him. And this is kind of his requirement as a priest in the church. If somebody confesses their sins to you and promises to atone for their sins, your job is to forgive them. It's called confession. And the Pope pardons him, reinstates him in the church, and they work out a situation where, okay, I'll pick the bishop, the church, and I give him his scepter and his crown and his symbols of power, and then you can give him his land. And so you got kind of a balance there between the powers between the nobility and the church. But now we are here in the high Middle Ages. This is the high point of church power. Here, from about 1000 or so, 1050, on up into about the 1300s or so. This is the period of the Great Schism that occurs, and the papacy is feeling stronger and stronger, and they come up with this concept of Christendom. It had always been there, but Innocent III said, yeah, fine, you guys can have your little vassalages, your little kingdoms, etc., but really, this entire area that is Christian, not down here, it's Muslim at this time, he said, that's one big united kingdom under Christ. And of course, who's the head of it? The Pope. He's not claiming a direct political control, but he is saying that in a spiritual sense, he's in charge. Which, is not much of a problem until you get into not much of a conflict until you get into the issue of excommunication. So, the Cluny Reform movement, etc., the Great Schism comes into play here. And then in 1092 comes the message from the Byzantine emperor saying, hey, we need some help against the Seljuks. They're about to overrun us. And the Pope, Innocent III, gives the Byzantine emperor is Alexis Comnenus I, and Urban II, I said Innocent III, it was Urban II at Claremont, preaches a sermon, etc. Claremont's down here in southern France, and in it he reads the letter from the emperor, from Alexius, and he says, we must answer the call of our Christian brother. And what he does is he calls for a crusade. And he does something. There's nothing in Christian theology that justifies this. He granted an indulgence of anyone who went to fight in the Crusades, to fight against the Muslim forces. And this allowed you to kill people who had not necessarily done any offense to you, and if you would die in battle, you went right to heaven. You would be forgiven immediately for your sins and go to heaven. And there's nothing in Christian theology to do this. It's an awful lot like the Islamic concept of jihad, kind of giving that same sort of impetus to it. And this gives rise to a series of wars that go on for several hundred years. Now, let's talk about this a little bit. Spain already had an ongoing crusade. And many of Charlemagne's invasions were a crusade, not necessarily against Muslims, but against pagans and forcing them into Christianity or converting them into Christianity. And this really gives you an idea of the power of the papacy at this particular time, is that the King of England, King of France, and the Holy Roman Emperor all agree to go on crusade to recapture the Holy Land. And the First Crusade is, to a certain extent, successful. Now, as you can see, this is around 1100, and the Islamic Caliphate has started to fragment. In fact, they're in a period of disorganization because the Persians are trying to assert themselves, the Arabs are trying to hang on, and then in come the Turks from out here, and then you've got the Byzantines over on that side fighting them. So the old hierarchy, the old caliphate where there's a united force and political entity, etc., is gone. Now this is an interesting map here. These are the routes of the Crusaders, and they're all heading for Constantinople. Okay, and interestingly enough, it's the Crusades that really begin the reemergence of towns and the increase in the size and importance of the middle class, because as armies come through, they need food, they need shelter, they need other supplies, and the towns quickly rise up to fill that void. And they all end up here at Constantinople. They're there, and then all of a sudden the emperor goes, "Oh, what have I done here? I've invited folks in, and now I'm not quite sure that I want them around," and he quickly encourages them to head for Jerusalem. Another thing, some historians state that the Crusades are the beginning of rabid anti-Semitism in Europe, because with the granting of indulgences by the Pope and the bishops, their license was to kill non-Christians. And unfortunately, there were Jewish communities and towns on the routes that I just showed you on the map, and some of the soldiers took advantage of that to attack the towns and attack the Jewish residents in towns and basically kill and destroy the towns and steal everything they could get their hands on. This was not sanctioned by the church, but they didn't do a whole lot to stop it either, because they needed the Crusaders for their own purposes. So here they are. The First Crusade ends up in Constantinople, and the emperor says, "Yeah, glad to see you. Now go take on the Arabs." And here's their route as they head on into the what is called the Holy Land. Now, theoretically, and here we go. This is what I was looking for. Theoretically, what they're trying to do is open up the Holy Land for Christian pilgrims to go there, which the Muslims from early on in their caliphate had allowed Christians to come in. When the Seljuk Turks, who were a much more warlike and again non-Arabic culture, came in, there was some friction, some intentional, some not, and that's when the Byzantine emperor asked for help. But what he was really afraid of was the Turks coming in on him. Well, what happened in the Crusades is basically the Holy Roman Emperor, Frederick Barbarossa, Frederick Redbeard, drowned on his way, so he never made it. The English king and the French king got into an argument. The French king left, and so basically the English king led the forces. And most of the troops were the lesser nobility, and that is, they were not the first sons. The first sons inherit everything. So why are they going to go on crusade? Because if they go to the Holy Land, they might get a chunk of territory for themselves. And that's exactly what happened. For about 200 years, right here, these are Christian enclaves in the middle of an Islamic sea. You've got up here, you're fighting the Turks. The Byzantines are above that. You've got Arabs all over here. Not easily defensible borders either. But what happens is the European soldiers who control these territories here become very, very wealthy, because now they are in the Middle East, and they are the primary middlemen in trade. And what do they trade? Sugar, which they learned to grow on the island of Cyprus, right here, where you had sugar plantations, and then spices from the Middle East. So the Crusades, which ultimately fail, are ultimately defeated in the Middle Ages. Still on the Crusades here. I want to get back. There we go. I don't want the Crusades. And let's see. This is the beginning of big changes here. The Crusades trigger some changes that break down the feudal system. Now, it takes us several hundred years for it to occur. Okay, you get the rise of towns. Towns arise because of the Crusades. Not entirely. There had always been towns, and towns had then, when they built their cathedrals, become religious centers, etc. But as people began to travel more, the needs of the town, the needs that the towns could fill, became more important, and the towns got bigger. And as they got bigger, they got wealthier, and some of the wealthiest towns put up walls. Now, from whom were they putting up walls? They were putting up walls from the medieval nobility. And they even began to have their own armed militia. Now, as they had the need for more workers, where did they get them? Serfs would run away to the cities and hide. And the law was, if you were there a year and a day, you were free and you got to stay. And so the size of cities grew. You had more skilled workers, and now the nobility has to figure ways to keep their serfs on the land, and you actually start to pay them for their work instead of taxing them for their particular work. So you've got the rise of towns. You have increased trade. Wealth. So the king sees this increased trade and wealth. What does he want to do it? He taxes the cities, because now the city dwellers are a greater source of revenue than his nobility. And what you start to have is an alliance between the town and the king at the expense of the nobility, because the towns were the middle class, the bourgeoisie, were actually rivals of the nobility. And as the towns became wealthier and could pay more taxes to the king, he could now pay for his own private army. In addition, as time had gone by, transportation, roads had improved, communication had improved, etc. And so the merchants who wanted a strong king, so they didn't have to worry constantly about invasion and problems with the nobility, began to form a closer alliance with the king. And you start to get the development of the sense of nationalism, the sense that I'm not just a resident of a particular town, I'm a resident of an area that has a sense of nationhood, of common language, common culture, common law, etc. And the medieval pyramid begins to start to unwind. And so what towns got from the king were charters, which are a contract between the king and the town, whereby if the town paid its taxes, the king would give them this protection or that protection or another. And so merchants become more and more important in the process. And as the new merchandise comes in from the Middle East, you now get the reemergence here of the old trade routes. You start to travel by sea, and you can get more goods on a boat than you can by land. But all these land routes open up as well, connecting towns, and the towns become mercantile centers as well as the religious centers as they had been. And the medieval pyramid politically is starting to unravel and starting to come apart in ways that nobody had ever imagined that they might. The other thing that came out of this period was the bubonic plague. I'll go to that on the computer. The bubonic plague came out of India. It came out of India. It first entered here in Genoa in southern Italy, came through the Byzantine Empire, and as you can see, by 1350 it spread to almost every place in Europe. You can't see it until I put the computer on. Here you see the graphic showing it. Why did the bubonic plague occur? And why didn't people from India, from where it came, why didn't they die? Because they had already gone through the epidemic. And when there's an epidemic, who survives? Those with immunities. So the bubonic plague was not a factor in India and Western China. But as trade increased because of the Crusades, the disease comes to Europe. It's traced back to Genoa. Rats got off the ship. The fleas are on the rats. The fleas jump off and bite people in their unsanitary surroundings in European cities. And it spreads like wildfire. 30–40% of the European population dies. Who survives? Those with immunities. They reproduce, and the children, via the mother's umbilical cord, have the immunities, and it's why none of us die of the bubonic plague. Somebody in our long-distant past had an immunity to it and passed it on to us, and that's why we didn't die. Unfortunately for Europe, that was not the case. But I'm going to take time right here and just kind of give a preview, because I'm going to get into Native American culture. This is exactly what happened in the Americas when Europeans arrived. Native American population had been isolated from the rest of the historical world for at least 10,000 years, and therefore had not gone through any of these plagues, and therefore had no immunities. So with the arrival, and it didn't matter whether it was Europeans, Asians, or Africans, they all had the same immunities, and they all carried the same diseases, and it was going to have its negative impact on Native Americans. But I'll get into that in more detail later. But this little interactive map here just shows how that in fact did occur. And then this plague, it really changed things. A couple things occurred. By the 1300s, the Crusades are over. And ultimately, the Christian armies are driven out. So this starts to undermine the authority of the papacy. Then you have the plague that occurs. And this, again, it undermines, disrupts social, economic life. On top of the disease, there's famine because there's less people to do the work, and so on. And so you have an economic and social decline that occurs during this particular time period. And the influence of the church and that power that it had 300 years earlier to call crusades diminishes considerably during that time period. And then when you combine these changes and the new relationship between the towns and the king, you start to get the emergence in Europe of what we call nation states. Okay, now the nation state is the most common political unit in the world today. It's what we call countries during this time period. And here is the definition of a state. It joins the political power of the state, of a nation, and it possesses sovereignty, that is, the right to rule itself. It's a political entity. It's a physical geographic entity. and it has a cultural and ethnic unity. Okay, it's a nation state, and this emerges in practice during this particular time period, what we call countries. And you now have more of a loyalty, or at least an equal loyalty of people to their nation state as to their church or to their immediate superior in the feudal system. And so what you get is the rise of national monarchies that occurs during this time period. I'm trying to look here for, see if I can find something that will, we'll see what we get out. It's the French Revolution. I don't want to do that. Okay. Okay, we'll start with the rise of the nation state with William the Conqueror. And this is a typical kind of situation. William is the son of the Duke of Normandy, who is a descendant of a Viking who had essentially seized Normandy from the King of France. And Harold was also a descendant of one of the early ancestors. And the king dies, and they both claim the throne. Harold rushes down here, and he meets close to the shore William when he crosses the English Channel at the Battle of Normandy. Not Normandy, the Battle of Hastings. The battle seems to be going Harold's way, and then in the middle of the battle, he's shot in the eye and has to disengage, and his troops surrender, and William, Duke of Normandy, becomes King of England. And as such, he brings in all of his nobles and some of the nobles here in England, and they now all become his vassals. And when the Crusades start, the subsequent kings are able to gather a good deal more loyalty from the towns, and England starts to see itself as a separate nation state. Now, this doesn't happen right away, because there's a little complication from William's conquest. And what you get out of that is the 100 Years' War. Did the 100 Years' War last 100 years? Yeah, it lasted longer than that. And the 100 Years' War was between England and France. The origin of the conflict is simply that the Duke of Normandy, who was now the King of England, also claimed land in France. And as the sense of nationhood started to emerge in France, there came to be a sense that we'd rather be ruled by a French king than by an English king. And they fought that war for over 100 years. England and France did. Ultimately, the French are able to drive the British out after 100 years. And this is one of the more remarkable persons in history, Joan of Arc. The French really are getting the worst of it most of the time during the 100 Years' War. They're about to be defeated, and a young woman, 18 years old, Joan, said, God has come and spoken to me, and he told me I am to lead the French to victory in battle. And she puts on armor, white armor, she's the White Knight. She goes to Orleans and leads the French army to victory over the British at Orleans and in several other places. She is considered to be the founder of French nationalism. Now, Joan doesn't end up with a very good fate. What happens with Joan is she's now a threat to the whole medieval structure. Now, we're talking here the 1300s, just before the rise of the bubonic plague, etc., and or just afterwards, excuse me. And look forward here on the. I'm not going to do the. French. Here she is, Joan of Arc. And here's a painting of Joan of Arc. After she helps drive the British out, there's other battles going on, and she's captured by the Burgundians, who are rivals to the King of France. And they offer the King of France the opportunity to ransom her. King says no. She's put on trial by the English, and she's tried and burned at the city of Rouen as a witch. Now, why doesn't the king rescue his savior? Well, number one, she's a woman who's a knight. Her leadership would upset the whole medieval hierarchy of the knight in shining armor sort of thing, and really would represent a power base that might be challenging to him. And so he allows the hero of French nationalism, Joan of Arc, to be burned at the stake as a witch. About 300 years later, the English declared, no, there was the Pope in the 1850s that says she wasn't really a witch at all. But the net effect of the 100 Years' War was that England and France now were completely separate entities, and they began to identify as Englishmen and as Frenchmen. And that becomes very important because now you have a unified political force and entity, as opposed to these fragmented medieval feudalistic kinds of states that occurred during the entire time period. Another interesting thing about the English and how English nationalism differed from French and most of the rest of Europe. I had talked about the divine right monarchy that came from Charlemagne. And so a divine right monarch was an absolute monarch. That is, he had all power. In England, you had a new concept, a limited monarchy. And again, this comes out of the Crusades. Richard the Lionhearted is off on the crusade, and he leaves his brother John to run the country while he's gone. Well, John's got problems. What he's got to do is he's got to raise taxes to pay for his brother off in the Holy Land. Then the French attack, so he's got to raise taxes to take on the French. And then his brother, on his way back from the Crusades, gets captured in Austria, and he has to raise tax money to get his brother ransomed. Needless to say, John's not a very good general, and he loses land in France. This is prior to the 100 Years' War. And so he tries to raise taxes again. The great nobles say, enough, we can't get any more taxes for you. And so they organize their armies, and John organizes his army, and John loses at the Battle of Runnymede in 1215, and he has to sign the Magna Carta. And this is the beginning of the evolution of democracy in England. Now, it takes a long time, and it actually gets to the United States in conclusion before it gets done in England, but it's the beginning. In it, John agrees that he will not raise taxes again unless he asks permission of the nobles. And they have to get together and talk about it in Parliament, which is, again, the English ruling class spoke French. And in French, to talk is parler, and so Parliament. It wasn't for, about another 100 years that the English kings exclusively spoke English. Just like when the present monarchy came in 1700s, they all spoke German rather than English. So you have this monarchy which limits the power of the king, limits his power to tax. It guarantees habeas corpus, the right to be charged before you are held for a criminal charge, trial by jury, etc. It applies at first to just the upper nobility, eventually comes to apply to the rest of the English population. So you get the emergence of nationalism there, England, France, Holland, etc. But where nationalism in the nation state does not develop, and this has a long-term consequence, is in the Holy Roman Empire, Germany, and in Italy. They remain very divided feudal states with the papal states right there in the middle, the Italian city-states here, and just a general decentralization of power that occurs during that time period. Now, the church goes from being the most powerful entity in Europe to being almost a laughingstock here. What happens for a period of time is the idea of Christendom, of the Pope being above all the national monarchies. The papacy comes to be controlled by the French national monarch. Okay? The Pope died, and the King of France happened to be in Rome when that occurred, and he basically went and intimidated the College of Cardinals into electing a French Pope. They had almost all been Italian before that. And then the papacy is moved from Rome to the French city of Avignon. Okay, for a period there of about 40 years, where the papacy is there in Avignon. And then from 1417 to 1449, the Pope was visiting Rome and he died, and then what you had was a mob of Romans who surrounded the College of Cardinals and forced him to elect an Italian Pope. So the King of France wasn't going to have that. He had his French cardinals elect the French Pope, and so you had two popes for about 20 years there before finally the Holy Roman Emperor steps in and settles the whole mess. My point here is that the church went from the ability to call the great kings to go on a crusade 300 years earlier to the point where they're being politically manipulated by the more powerful kings of nation states. So this represents a big, big change. The last thing I'm going to go through here now is the Renaissance as it occurs in Italy. And again, what does Renaissance mean? The Renaissance means rebirth, okay, and what is reborn? It's the classical learning of the Greco-Roman period. The Renaissance begins about 1350 or so. And it finds its beginnings here in places like this. This is Renaissance Florence. And as you can see, it's a city of fine buildings. You've got the big church in the middle of town here, the Duomo, the largest dome ever built up to that time, even larger than Hagia Sophia. And they had become wealthy from the Crusades and the trade that had gone on. They are now the middlemen. But they'd also developed another industry on their own, the textile industry. They would have different people in the countryside, even within the city. They would have them spin yarn. They would then have them weave it, and then they would either sell the whole cloth or oftentimes maybe clothing itself might be sold entirely. But usually it was cloth. And believe it or not, Florence and the other Italian city-states became fabulously wealthy off the trade from the Crusades itself, and it also began to the change in education and learning that came about from the rediscovery of these European or Middle Eastern artifacts, the writings of Plato and Socrates, etc. And what happened was the medieval educational system, which again saved literacy, etc. in the European period. It is here's the definition of it. It's a method of critical thought dominated by the academics in the medieval universities. But its purpose was to defend dogma, and dogma were the truths that were determined and handed down by the church. And so subsequently you learned in order to prove that the positions of the truth of the church, its absolute positions, etc., were correct. And this was challenged by the practice of humanism. Humanism is the educational philosophy that replaced scholasticism, and it wasn't an easy battle either. There was a battle for a while between the scholastic and the humanist. Humanism emphasizes the value and agency of human beings. Up to this point, and we know who the great Renaissance artists were: Michelangelo, Raphael, Leonardo, etc. They, for the first time as artists, signed their paintings. Iconographers to this day, people who drew icons in particularly Orthodox churches, do not sign their work because they say, I didn't make that, God made it through my hands, I am the mere vehicle. Whereas the humanist said, no, I'm the bright guy, I did this is my unique talent. And again, this is one of the big differences between Eastern and Western culture. Eastern culture, more of an emphasis on the group, on the family, whereas Western culture, the individual. And along with the individual, they became more secular. Now, not atheistic, but not entirely religious. They became more concerned with affairs of humans and the idea of empiricism. Now, notice that word, where'd we encounter that before? Way back with the Greeks. And by the time you get here to the Renaissance, you get the rise of science. Okay, the algebra comes from the Crusades, comes out of the Middle East. The concept of the zero and the base 10, where you can do mathematics a lot easier. The findings of the alchemists. They never did make gold out of lead, but they learned lots of other things, and you begin to get a rise in science. And more of a sense of being able, like the Greeks did, of discovering what actually was true or false about the universe. And one of the first guys, one of the first humanists that began to use the scientific method that was coming of age here during the Renaissance. We tend to look upon the Renaissance as an artistic movement, but it's also a period of science. Let me see here. He came up with the idea of the heliocentered centered universe. That is, that the Earth went around the sun. Okay, and he was able to observe this from the newfangled invention, the telescope. He did that, and he declared that it went around in a circle. As we know, it's elliptical. This was refined later by Kepler when he took mathematics and proved it was elliptical rather than circular. But this stood things on its ear, because the Ptolemaic system, let me see if I can find a picture of it. That's the medieval world. I want to look for the Ptolemaic universe. There's some really neat pictures of it. I guess I can't find it here on the computer. But there was an elaborate design that showed how the Earth was in the center, the sun went around, the moon went around, Mars, Jupiter, the stars all centered around it. And Copernicus says, no, not true. The church didn't like it, but he said, hey, I can't argue with it. The scientific facts prove otherwise. And from this point on, you get what is called the rise of science in the West, which is one of the major outcomes of the Renaissance. This is a little bit later. I'm not going to talk about Newton now, but Galileo is the other great astronomer that challenges the Ptolemaic universe. Was arrested and kept under house arrest most of the late part of his life for having dared to challenge the Earth-centered universe of Ptolemy's, which was about 300 BCE, with Copernicus's science-centered or heliocentric universe. My point being here is this is where Europe is starting to become dynamic. Hinduism had produced a static society in India. Islam in the heartlands was a very static traditional society. It wasn't much different in 1300 than it had been in 700. China under Confucianism was becoming more and more I don't want to use the word stagnant, but a lack of mobility within the society. Japan and Korea are adopting Confucianism, etc. In the West, which is behind economically in many other ways, becomes the dynamic place where change takes place and new things are found and new things are discovered. So it's the rise of science that really is a major characteristic of this late medieval period and really begins the modern period. Now, it would be remiss if I don't talk about the Renaissance artist. And then I'll wrap this up. This is truly one of the more remarkable pieces of artwork you'll ever see. It's the David. It's about 18 feet tall, and it sits in its own small museum inside of Florence. And it was in the Italian city-states that the patrons, the wealthy bankers, the wealthy owners and merchants began to patronize the arts. And again, when do the arts flourish? In periods of peace and prosperity. And as I said, I showed you this painting of Florence there. But here are the Italian city-states. And as you can see, they are not united the way England and France are. They are not nation-states, but they are very, very wealthy. And they're able to take care of themselves for the most part. And they are patrons of the arts, and they're the people that pay the artists and allow them to have a good living during this time period. But long story short, a couple of the city-states become jealous of the other ones, and they call the King of France in to help them. Well, the King of France gladly comes in, and then he takes over the entire northern area of the states. This is the time period when the Renaissance writer Machiavelli, he witnesses what has happened, and he said, man, we screwed up. He said, the trouble with our rulers is that they were too honest. And he took the opposite position of Confucius, who said the gentleman, the prince, must be noble, kind, just, virtuous, etc. Well, Machiavelli said, that's not necessary. All that is necessary is that you appear to be those things, because what you're ultimately doing is trying to protect your political power, and he is the founder of this quote, that the end justified the means. Meaning that if your goal is worth achieving, then you can do anything to achieve it. Now, he was talking about it in the realm of political power and a political sense, and became really kind of the handbook for many politicians from the Renaissance period onwards. So you really have a flourishing of art and artwork during this time period. Let me see if I can plague. Here you have Leonardo da Vinci. Looking for his most well-known painting, not finding it. Oh, here's certainly one of his most well-known, The Last Supper. We've all seen variations on this, but this is the most well-known of the paintings of The Last Supper. This is Da Vinci's, and it's in Milan. It's painted on the wall of the church in Milan. And then, of course, here's his other great painting, the Mona Lisa, which is considered one of the first great psychological paintings. Now, again, it's a great painting, but it's different. It's not a religious painting. It's a person, and it is an attempt to give you an emotional kind of sense of who and what this person is about. And to be honest, it's quite mysterious and really accounts for his reputation. Of course, I want to go back to Michelangelo here if I can find it. It's Leonardo. Let me see. And this is the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. Took him several years laying flat on his back, painting this on scaffolds. And the Pope would occasionally, Julius would come up and try to give him advice and hints about what he wanted him to do. Michelangelo didn't much like it, but he didn't do much about it. But after Julian died, he painted his face on the face as the face of Satan in the Last Judgment segment that sits right outside the Sistine Chapel. So you can see, there's big changes. Both in artwork, the sense of individuality, etc., that comes out of this. But what you really get is a big change in science. And it's this change in science, the rise of towns, the rise of nation states, that really sets the stage for Europe to go from the kind of the bottom of the heap in terms of political, social, economic development till by the 20th century, where it's in a period of complete accession. Okay, I think I'm stopped there, and I will see you next time. We'll be talking about first Native Americans during the same time period, and in Africa during this time period. Okay.